All right, we live here. How we doing out there? Dan Sheehan here from Cali Roots, Ineffable, coming to you on this Q&A. It's hope everybody's doing good out there. It's it's definitely challenging times we're in right now, but we are all hanging in there. Um, and a little brief history about me. I started in the music industry probably about 20 years ago. Can't keep track right now. And about 20 years ago, started doing shows in Santa Cruz, at the Vets Hall. And before that, I was on the island of Guam for 2 years. I was a radio DJ there for a couple years. And it's from there we kind of just started doing shows at the Vets Hall, and we did a bunch of Hawaii tours and other shows, and really kind of grinded it out, doing a lot of reggae shows. We did a lot of shows with Midnight and Israel Vibration, and a lot of those roots bands. And then we kind of started doing a lot of stuff we're doing at Cali Roots now. I came on Cali Roots in 2012. My partner, Jeff Monzer, who started Cali Roots, we became partners that year. And we really kind of grew that brand to what it is now. And then, we definitely have come a long way. And, then a Roots. So you can catch that at 7 p.m. Pacific time. That's, I think tonight we have Pepper. Last night we had Alba Rosie. These are from various years that we have, put out. So, that's the Cali Roots Couch Sessions, trying to definitely bring a little light to everybody. And we all know that we're missing live music right now, and which I know for me, live music is obviously the reason why we're in this industry. So we're throwing that out. We also have the Cali Roots Rhythm, which just came out a couple weeks ago. Collie Buds and Johnny Cosmic produced Rhythm. The first single was Collie Buds, and then we released The Movement last week, and excited to have the next one, which is Anthony B. And that's on that Cali Roots Rhythm. That's coming out what would have been Cali Roots weekend, May 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. That's kind of trying to give people as much good vibes as possible. So I think we got a question here from EJ, kind of asking what are some of my favorite music artists. I grew up listening to a lot of the roots reggae. I grew up in Hawaii, where roots reggae and reggae music in general is massive. And so I grew up with some of obviously the classics, like the Gladiators and Israel Vibration, and Lucky Dubé and Bob Marley. Obviously currently, I think there's a lot of bands that I really like. There's like the Elevators are a band I listen to a lot right now. I really dig those guys. I think obviously Stick Figure and all those guys, but I think I also listen to a lot of music that's not reggae. I've been listening to a lot of country music and some of that bluegrass stuff, like Tyler Childers, Camp, Cody Jinks, stuff like that. I think it's important to kind of mix up the music that you're listening to kind of keep everything fresh and really appreciate what you are listening to. So it's kind of just touching on what I want. So let's see. Let me look at another question here from Connor. What state would you like to do a festival in that you've never done before? I think mean, I'm a West Coast guy. Obviously, I would love to do a festival. I think in the state of Oregon would be somewhere where we would love to do something. I think Oregon is. I think there's a lot of open land there. There's good. There's the beer is really weed's really good there, and the people are really good there. So I think Oregon would be a great place to jump in and do some stuff at some point. But obviously we have to get through these current states before we kind of add anything else to the plate. What other questions do we have here? How has talent buying changed over the last 3 weeks? That's a really good question. I think there's been a lot of rescheduling of dates, which I think is obviously a lot different than how we usually book. I think we really have to kind of look at when these rescheduled dates are happening. Obviously the safety of the fans and the safety of the staff and artists are the top priority, and so you really have to be conscious of when these rescheduled dates are coming up. And so I think there's a lot of dates that are being rescheduled for the fall, which makes for a very busy fall. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is put as many dates. I think the music industry as a whole is pushing a lot of dates into the fall, which you're trying to put 7 months of touring into 3 months, which will have its challenges. But I think that's kind of how talent buying has changed over the last few weeks. I think artists and agents and managers and promoters are working as well as they have ever worked together. In this current situation, I think we all need to work together to really kind of help the music industry get through what we're currently going through. So yeah, it's definitely a lot of changes, and we're every single day is a different thing. Every single day we're moving a show. We have to find new dates for a show, and then you have to be aware of what artists are already playing that market or surrounding markets during that time. Let's see what other questions we have come in. Let's see. This is from Kara. Big shout out to Kara. Thanks, SoCal Street Team. Let's see. Did you and Jeff ever think that Cali Roots would grow into what it is today? That's another really good question. I think obviously when you start something or you're a part of something, you really want to you have great aspirations for it, and I think the question to that is not really. I don't think we expected it to grow to the level that it is now. I think there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into Cali Roots to kind of really push it to where it's at now, and it's still. I mean, every single festival that we do, under the California Roots umbrella, is it has its challenges. But I think, did we ever expect it to get this big? No. But I think by year 4 or 5, we really start to realize, like, all right, this thing has legs and it's moving. And, the fans have really kind of taken ownership of it too, which I think is also a big thing on how Cali Roots has grown to where it's at, is that the fans have really, taken ownership of it. And I think that's something that we didn't necessarily expect to happen the way it did, and it's become such a really strong community. Without the fans, the bands, that make up this community, I think that's kind of really played a factor in how it's grown so much. So let's see, what other questions do we have here? Let's see. What went intact? What went into moving the festival with the entire lineup intact? I think we made the decision. I can't remember the date. The days are like losing track of days and dates and stuff. But it was a week before we announced that we were making the move, that we decided we had to make the move. Really for the safety of everybody involved. Obviously my staff, the fans, the community, Monterey, everybody involved. We really had to make that decision. And I literally, we got out our whiteboards in our office and we went through a master to-do list on what we needed to do. And the office, we went into attack mode. We just really started. I called all the agents and managers. In a matter of 2 hours, I talked to every single band. Um, and by the next day, we got commitments from probably 80% of those bands that they would move over with us. And over the next few days, we got the other 20% done. And I think the last band that was able to confirm that they could do it was called Tour Prophetica. And we got that word. A couple artists had to switch days, like Trevor Hall and J Boog switched. Ayaterra could only do the Sunday, so we had to make some adjustments like that. But I mean, I really think my whole thought process on this was I wanted to get the lineup at least 90% done before we made the announcement, so we could give people like, hey, we have to switch these dates, and here's the lineup moving forward. So people knew that, the lineup that they bought tickets for, in May was the same lineup we're having in October. And so I think, that was kind of a big move. But, all the other logistics that go into moving a festival of any size, my entire staff really kind of stepped up, and we knocked everything out from talking to our vendors and making sure that they could all do it, to calling, the hotels that we work with, to the campgrounds that we work with, to, switching up marketing, getting new artwork and all that stuff. It was a challenge, but I mean, that's also kind of what we do. I mean, that's, in the event space, you really have to, pivot on a dime. You really have to, make decisions and make them rather quickly, so you can, so you really can, kind of make the right decision, and make it as fluid as possible. So this is all uncharted territory, uncharted waters for all of us, and so we're learning every single hour on how to adapt our businesses to this. So, but yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell. That's how we moved the festival with with the full lineup. So let's see what other questions we have here. Um, Yeah, this is another good question, and this is a question that I deal with daily. This is from Woody. He would like to know if Cali Roots 12 will be able to get set up for May 2021, short turnaround from October of this year. That's a great question, and I think that's something that we're looking at. We're looking at in real time. How does this make sense? It's we realize that the turnaround from October to May is it's what, 7 months, and that's a short time to turn around a festival, and we have to be really conscious and cautious of that. And so I don't have the answer for that yet, but it's definitely something that is 100% on my mind daily, like I said, to really make sure we're making the right decision for May 2021. So what else we got here? How do I determine what bands play on what stage and at what time? So I have kind of a grid that I set up on a whiteboard in my office, and it's kind of really when I start the booking process, I have my times and days kind of laid out the way I want them to, and obviously you have a wish list, and you kind of go after a bunch of different artists that you really want. You start with your headliners, and you kind of work your way down, and as we go through and we start getting artists confirming or not confirming, then the list keeps changing, but it's changing within the grid of my schedule, and so I kind of, I know who's going to close the Cali Roots stage, or who's going to open the bowl, and I have desired artists I really want to open the bowl. I feel like the Elevators opening the bowl, is kind of, it's a big step for them, but it's a good look for the festival. Really, I try to put, growing bands, bands that have really got a lot of traction in that role, because I feel after they open the bowl, then they kind of move on to the next part of the lineup. And so it's all kind of coming together. I mean, it's like we really try to kind of, put artists that are similar, but also slightly different, so we can kind of pull from different tickets, from different, sales. But like, this year, like the Sunday was kind of the day that I really wanted to kind of turn into what it is. I mean, I think, Damian Marley, Ice Cube, Sublime with Rome, Jimmy Cliff, I think it's, such a massive day, and that day was built by design, and so I think, I think you have to go into talent buying and building a festival lineup with intent. It's like you can't just throw a bunch of bands on and call it a festival. I mean, you can, and people do that, but I think the way we operate is we like to, we kind of consider it an art form where you kind of build the lineup, you build everybody on the lineup. There's purpose with it. So, yeah, that's it's one of the funner processes that we do is kind of building the lineup. Especially the early parts of the lineup before we really get into heavy negotiations on the artists and stuff. So let's see here. What do we got? Let's see what else we got here. Got from Brad from Reggaeville. What's up, Brad? I think he's. Have you ever considered a vacation type festival like Closer to the Sun? I think there's really a place for those kind of festivals. I think more and more people are going to be attracted to those smaller festivals that are more of a destination. I've always wanted to do kind of like a domestic destination festival. Where it's in the U.S. It's fairly easy to get to, but it's secluded. I do feel there's definitely kind of a vacation festival, in the future. Again, I think, like I said earlier, I think it's all about getting through these next 12 months and then, looking at what we do, because I think the entire festival landscape will change. What that changes, I'm not sure, but I think people will definitely want to attend the smaller, more intimate festivals more. I mean, I've been to Closer to the Sun. I mean, it's a fantastic festival. The Slightly Stupid guys do a great job putting that on. And so I think there's definitely something that's could potentially happen there for sure. Let's see what else we got. Michael Jones, Michael Jones, why did you stop doing Carolina sessions? We'd really enjoy having Cali Roots back in North Carolina. May I suggest Greensboro for the next Carolina sessions? I mean, I love the Carolina sessions. We had great partners on that. And I think when we moved it to South Carolina, I think that was probably a move we might have not should have done. I think that going to Myrtle Beach definitely wasn't exactly aligned with what we were trying to accomplish. Wilmington was a perfect home for it. We just ran out of venues in Wilmington. There's really no venue. After Battleship Park stopped doing shows. And Greensboro has definitely been something we've looked at. I think there's definitely something there. So who knows? It might come back. We really enjoyed it, and I think it was a lot of fun to produce those events. And those were kind of the earlier years. I remember the first Carolina sessions we did. I can't remember what year it was. But Nako was on it, and Soja was headlining, and this was Nako's. This is our first show we ever did with him. Obviously, since then we've done a ton of other business with him. But it was so cool to see him. It's so raw. That it was like 5-6 years ago. Again, I can't remember how long ago it was, but I think there's a lot of memories that came out of Carolina sessions, and there was a lot of people that we ended up creating lifelong relationships and bonds with through those events. So hopefully we're able to bring that back at some time. What do we got here? K-Bong, my man, K-Bong. What was one of your favorite and most memorable performances at Cali Roots? That's a great question. I will be completely honest. The fact that I'm producing the event and running around, I don't get to see as much music as I'd like to. It's a slight bummer, but at the same time, I also get massive joy out of actually producing the event and running it. But last year I did take the time and I literally watched an entire set, which I haven't done in years at Cali Roots. I watched Tosh Santana's full set last year, and there was something really, really, really special about it. And it's one of those times where I think why we all got into music, the joy that it brings you, the chicken skin that you get from it, and just kind of there's no other feeling that really, there's no other like feeling that you can really kind of compare it to, like that what real good music gives you. And I really got that from her set last year. It was like really spiritual, and really kind of something that I think really kind of elevated me for the rest of the rest of the day. And that was so. If I had to say one set from last year, it was probably the Tosh Santana set, just because I was able to experience it, experience the full set. Um, but yeah, I mean, I end up watching a lot of a lot of the sets we have on streaming after the event. So, but and another question is, what was the first live show you ever attended? The first live show I've ever attended was actually Oswald at the Waikiki Shell. I was 7 or 8 years old, and I was young at this show, and it kind of really opened my eyes to live music. And anybody that's ever been to the Waikiki Shell, back in the day knows how fun it could be. For an 8-year-old, it was really eye opening, and I ended up seeing many more shows at the Shell. But yeah, that was the first live show I went to, was Oswald. Great band. If you guys haven't checked them out, great roots band out of the UK. Yeah, Oswald. What else we got here? Let's see. Tim G. Hey, is it possible to ask about Dry Diggins this year, and if pushing Cali Roots back closer to Dry Diggins will affect it? That's a great question too. I mean, I think currently, there's nothing. Neither will affect each other currently. But again, like, I think we're monitoring the situation as a whole, just kind of monitoring, what will happen through the summer, how the fall will play out. So currently, there's Dry Diggins is nothing, no changes there. So let's see here. Michael Murphy. Let's see here. Michael Murphy. Sorry, I'm reading this on my phone. Michael Murphy, how were you able to gain the trust of some of the first artists you began working with? I mean, really, it's all about ethics. It's all about, doing what you're going to say you're going to do. I think, just in general, as a human being, right? I mean, I think, you're only as strong as your word. And for me, that's the values we've always lived on. You have to deliver on what you're going to say you're going to do. And sometimes things happen, and you have to audible out of it and change things up. But for the most part, there was people trusting me. There's people, the artist trusted me. We always delivered on the shows, even if a show wasn't going to do well financially. Like, we always delivered on a show. And I think there's a lot of promoters that definitely don't follow along those guidelines. And that was kind of a big thing for me, was definitely like having strong character. And I think a lot of the bands, I've worked with a lot of these bands for many years now. And they know what they're going to get when they with us. And it's trust is a big thing. So yeah. What else we got here? Let's see. The one from Brad. Also, what impact do you feel Cali Roots specifically has on the rise of Stick Figure and other bands like Hyrie? I mean, I think we have a platform. I think the way we look at it with bands like Stick Figure and Hyrie is that we're in this together. It's like we're trying to rise each other up. It's important to the festival. It's important to the scene that we have more bands that are headliners, that are selling tickets, that have that connection to the fans. I think it's extremely important to keep growing this music. And obviously we're big Stick Figure fans. Stick Figure is probably my daughter's favorite band. She's 4.5, and she calls him Coco's daddy. And she so there's a fan base that's connected to it. I mean, Hyrie performed at my daughter's first birthday party, and so I think we obviously have strong personal connections to these artists, and we also believe in the music that they're putting out. We're believing in the vibe and the connection that they have, and so we've all grown together. So and it's always amazes me, like Stick Figures summer tour. Like the number of tickets that they sold and the on sales and all that stuff. It's for me, it's definitely, we take pride in it because we know that we have given a platform with Cali Roots and everything that we're doing to help growing that, and same thing with Hyrie. It's like the numbers that she's doing and the connection that she has to her fans. We take pride in all that. We take pride in all these bands doing the business that they're doing. I think it's important, and I think that's kind of what separates us from other festivals, that we are kind of slightly kind of like the tastemakers within this scene. And we also, like I said, believe in the bands. So yeah, that's kind of that's a good question. Let's see. Here's another one from here's one from Ryan. What international reggae festival do you most feel comparable to Cali Roots experience? That's a great question. I mean, I haven't been to any international festivals, but I think Rototom, we had a good connection with them. It's obviously much larger than ours, but I think the vibe is definitely kind of from what I've been told, is definitely in line. I would one festival I'd really love to go to is Boomtown. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that festival, but that festival seems absolutely amazing. So, but yeah, that's I definitely need to get out there and go to some of these international festivals. Let's see here. From Marissa, what was the last show you attended? The last show I attended was Pepper at the Catalyst, literally a week before the shelter in place went down. So that was actually a really good show to go to. It's always good to see the guys. Yeah, that was the last show I went to, was Pepper at the Catalyst. Let's see. In your opinion, who is the best live performer in our scene? Gosh, that is a hard question. I don't know if I can answer that, to be honest. Yeah, I don't think I can answer that one. There's so many different elements of performance, right? I mean, there's Revolution with their massive light show and kind of the production that they bring, and then there's Stick Figure with with that energy on stage, and there's the OGs like Slightly Stoopid doing their thing. Then you have artists like Damian Marley, who comes with this incredible energy. So yeah, it's a really hard question to answer, and I don't know if I might get on a slippery slope if I answer that question. So let's see what else we got here. Let's see here. Thank Reed Foster for feeding me these questions. So, let's see. This is from CMB Reggae. Do you self-finance, or do you put these shows together on credit? No, we're self-financed. We, which is why it's a really crazy time for us right now. We don't have any backers. There's no investors involved with us. We kind of do everything in-house. I'm definitely not a fan of putting things on credit, because I think that will just kind of set you up for disaster later. So we are definitely 100% self-financed. We have no corporate backing on us, or anything like that. It's all us. Let's see what else we got here. Let's see. Here's from Dana. For artists aspiring to make it in the lineup for the festival, like Cali Roots, what do you recommend? That's a great question. I get that question asked a lot, and I think my main thing is keep keep on the grind, right? It's like you also you have to make sure everything is dialed in. Like you got to your socials are proper. I mean, you don't need 100,000 people to get on Cali Roots, or 100,000 followers. I think the main thing is that your socials are engaged, your YouTube page is up to date, and I think for me that shows a lot of professionalism and drive. If you have all those things kind of in place, obviously having a booking agent and a manager, that helps, because it's for me it's easier to deal with an agent and a manager, but at the same time that's not kind of a make or break it. I mean, I'm all about giving young bands a shot, but the young bands have they gotta want a shot too. They gotta be able to. I can't tell you how many times I get emails from people that just has one sentence, how do I get on the festival? It's like, or, here, please book me now. It's like, that really doesn't help me. That doesn't, for me, it's like, well, I mean, you're not putting in the effort to get in front of me and impress me with what you have, and for me that just shows that that I'm not going to take the effort to look into booking you either. And I think having a nice organized social clean emails goes a long way with getting on it, and also making sure that you're out there grinding and like playing and touring, and you have merch, and you're taking those extra steps to kind of get your name out there. That's definitely all those things are things I look at. I mean, I think it's important to again, you have to you have to put a lot of work into your craft. Like we all put work into what we do. Bands that want to put, get on festivals and want to keep growing have to do the same thing. So yeah, that's like I said, it's a very common question, and I'm glad it was asked. So yeah, this one's from our guy Bulldog. When are you going to start a Cali Roots podcast? That's a great question. I think it comes down to time. I think time is the biggest factor in starting things like that. We do have our own radio show on Sirius XM, the Cali Roots radio show. But a podcast, I mean, it sounds fun, but again, it all comes down to how much time is actually in the day between business, festivals, and a family. So let's see here. What else do we have? It's from Aaron out in Hawaii, asking if there's any chance of a Hawaii route someday. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think, obviously I grew up there. There's always been we did a lot of shows in Hawaii. We were the first ones to bring Soja there many years ago. We did Revolution out there. Obviously, we've done a lot of roots artists. And so, Hawaii roots could definitely happen. Again, it's just a matter of getting through the next 12 months before we can actually look at adding any new events or anything like that. I just want to kind of, I think our main focus right now is focusing on what we have on the book, so we can like I said, weather this storm that we're all currently going through. So so here's another good one because it's daily. How do you juggle work life, home, family life? That's not easy. The fortunate thing is, I have a wife that's also, in the business with me. She works with me at Cali Roots and Ineffable, and she has worked with me for many, many years. So she understands, the industry that we're in. I think, after I had my daughter, 4.5 years ago, that kind of really kind of changed kind of my perspective on things a little bit for the better. I think now, you have to work those 10 to 12-hour days, but you have to do them very smart. And I'm not trying to, kind of get bogged down with things that aren't productive. And I think, having a kid kind of really kind of like opens that up. Everything you do has got to be purpose, and it's got to matter. And so that's kind of, again, and as we were doing shows, my family, like if we do a show at Avila Beach, outside of San Luis Obispo, they usually come down with me for the weekend, and we make a weekend trip out of it. They come and we're doing Revolution there, and then the family will come down, we'll get a little hotel, the girls will go to the beach, and and I think it's I think the family balance is extremely important. Obviously, as we get closer to festivals, the workload gets a little bit more crazy, but I'm fortunate to have an incredible staff and team around me, and great partners that enable me to like not have to do those 16-hour days like we used to years ago. But yeah, the balance is important, and it's not easy either. Let's see. What do you think is an underutilized but highly effective marketing tool website for bands? I think one of the things, obviously, I think in this current state, I think one of the things that people are, bands, are starting to use more, and I think they have been, but I think YouTube is becoming a massive platform. If you have the content to put out, or you can create the content to put out, I think YouTube is becoming, is really strong for bands. And I know like for us for Cali Roots, we definitely have been increasing our YouTube knowledge and pushing our YouTube stronger. And I think bands should definitely use that more, especially up and coming bands. Again, if you have content or you can create content, put it on YouTube, and also put it on YouTube and optimize your page to the do everything that YouTube lays it out for you and how to really kind of turn your page into something that is really effective. And I think if you can follow those guidelines and put it out there, I think it would be huge. And so again, like I said, we're working a lot on our YouTube, and I think that's one of the things that I feel has been underutilized by some, but definitely there's some people that have really mastered it. So yeah. Let's see here. Oh, and there's my daughter McKenna, and this is the joys of working from home. What you doing? You want to say hi? You want to say hi to everybody?
Who are you even talking to?
There's people there. You can't see them, but they're out there. You gonna wave at everybody? No. All right. Is that a hard no?
We're just here to get a box, all right?
Okay, you go get a box. We're also in the process of moving during this too, so there's that's also going on as well. So let's see here. Let's see here. All right, my man, Collie Buds. Yo, Dan, what's your favorite kind of pizza? Asking for a friend. Sausage and mushroom is my favorite pizza by far. So if we get lucky enough to have a Collie Buds pizza party at Cali Roots again, please make mine sausage and mushroom. Thank you.
I want cheese pizza with mushroom.
Yeah, cheese pizza with mushrooms, Collie. You got that? Justin Bergeson, why haven't you posted more sets from last year on YouTube? Also, where is the photo album for 2019? That's a great question. The photo album for 2019, I'll have to find out for you on that one. I'm sure Dana, who does our marketing and social media, can give me more information on that. And more sets from last year. Go to our YouTube, Cali Roots Tube. There's all kinds of sets on there. We're posting more and more daily, and so just follow the page. And when we have new pages come up, new sets come up, they will they'll pop up there. So let's see here from Taylor Guitars. What artist that hasn't played the festival are you most excited to have on? If we're talking about artists who haven't played for this year, I think Jimmy Cliff, who's a absolute legend. Who's an absolute legend. I think having him on this year is massive. I grew up listening to Jimmy. If we're talking about an artist that has never played that I would love to get on the festival, it would have to be Manu Chao or Fat Freddy's Drop. I've tried to get Manu Chao on the festival for many years, and he's just not he's not going to do it currently. Hey, sweetie, so Fat Freddy Drop's another one out of New Zealand. We did them in Hawaii 9 years ago, and it's the last time we did a show with them. But yeah, those are a few bands that I'm also really stoked to have Ice Cube on it too. It's another West Coast hip hop legend, which I think is really cool that we got Ice Cube this year. So let's see what else we have. Let's see. From Keith, some of my favorite shows are at Avila. How did that venue come into play? So our partners down there, Bruce Howard, he's been doing shows there for 30 years. And he was kind of like a mentor for me for years. And I think the first show that I did there was Damian Marley and Nas maybe years ago. And it's one of my favorite venues too. I don't think it gets much better than the Central Coast outdoors on the beach. I think it's definitely one of the premier venues out there. So yeah, that's how Avila, and hopefully we continue to still do shows at Avila for many years to come, because I like any excuse to take my family to the beach to go do a show. So let's see. Um, here's one from Aaron. Any local food at Cali Roots? Local food is, when they're talking about local food, they're talking about, like Hawaiian food, island food. We have musubis at Cali Roots. We always have musubis at Cali Roots, and obviously, Timmy over at Pono's, he brings his truck out and he does, poke and Kahlua pig and stuff like that. So, we always have to have the island food at Cali Roots. So, let's see. Big shout out to Mike Love and the movement, all tuning in. Thank you guys. Quick story about the movement. So years ago, I don't have it with me. I wish I did. A couple years ago, they gifted me. I'm a big Steelers fan, Pittsburgh Steelers fans, and they gifted me this really cool old school helmet that I wish I had with me because I could totally wear it right now. But they gifted that to me, so it sits in my in my office. Obviously, we're all sheltering in place, so we're not at our office. You can see I'm working in my kitchen. So, yeah, big ups to the movement. Big ups to Mike Love. All these bands that we've built relationships. The Reese Brothers. So Reese Brothers are actually the question. What are the first steps you take for putting together the lineup for Cali Roots? I touched on this earlier. I think, for me, the first step is just kind of getting just a brain dump of bands we want. Obviously, there's a lot of bands that we have, every year or every other year. But we start with, kind of a big brain dump with everybody. Like, who do we want to see this year? Who's out there that we can get? And then we kind of create a list of like who's out of the box, who's some of the artists that are, that haven't played Cali Roots, and we kind of just go through that list and we kind of whittle it down to something, what we can actually afford, because some artists, we really want, but we can't necessarily, pay the price tag. And so that's kind of the first process. And then, obviously I look at kind of like some of the regional bands that are grinding it out there and who's on these tours, and just kind of watching, doing, like I said, watching a lot of YouTube and checking out some of the live sets. And so that's kind of the process how it starts. It's like I said, it's getting everything out of my head. Obviously that list starts even before the current Cali Roots plays out. It's a constant thing that we're constantly looking at, and then we run surveys too. We ask the fans all the time who they want to see, I think for the most part we do a pretty good job with kind of giving people a taste of everything. We got obviously the old school roots reggae. We got the new reggae. We got try to put some dance hall stuff on there. We have obviously we do some jam bands and hip hop and kind of the bluegrass stuff, and that all that kind of stuff kind of plays into the Cali Roots vibe. So let's see. Let me keep pulling up questions here. Let's see. Here's one from Corey. How do you go about evaluating what sponsors and activations to include in the fest? I think that's a really good question. I think we pride ourselves on having select sponsors involved. I think we could do the corporate route maybe and maybe get a little bit more money out of sponsors. Like we could have Budweiser there, or we could have Coca-Cola there. But for me, it never really has aligned with our brand, which is why we've always worked with the smaller breweries like Sierra Nevada and we're working with Firestone this year and Altamont Brewing. We like to kind of keep along that smaller brand. Granted, some of those like Sierra Nevada and Firestone are corporations, but I think I think they more. And I think you have to be really conscious of who you have at the festival to make sure it's something that the fans don't come into and they're like, well, Cali Roots is sold out, or Cali Roots is definitely like not it becomes this big advertisement for corporate sponsors. Obviously we work a lot with cannabis sponsors as well, and I think obviously the cannabis space in California is huge, but we also have to be really careful on not having too many cannabis sponsors, because I think then all of a sudden it becomes just a giant cannabis festival, which there's a lot of people partaking in it, but it's Cali Roots has never claimed to be a cannabis festival. So so it's definitely an evaluation. I think obviously we try to raise the most money possible because sponsor money is a big part of how we are able to make the festival work from a financial standpoint. But Yeah, it's a process. Me and Jeff kind of go through it and figure out which sponsors are the right sponsors, and then we kind of go from that. I mean, it's definitely some sponsors that we'd love to have. I mean, I'd love to have Subaru or Toyota there, and but and so we it's a process. So um, let's see what else we got here. Um, Hal Archer, has there been a significant positive change that you could share that has come from this current situation that will help bands prosper in the future, financially, promotionally, things like that? That's we're all dealing with this right now, right? I mean, I think unlike anything that's ever happened, um, I think this is something that has affected every single one of us. And I think what we're trying to take from this is that. Um, we're all in this together, and I think from a band standpoint, I think how bands have adapted to kind of the current situation, going back to YouTube and the streaming platforms, really kind of putting focus on some of those things and really giving people and the fans more content that people can connect with. I think that's kind of really what this is showing us right now, is that we need to have other avenues to give the fans more content and more ways to connect to the artist, where it's not just at a live show, it's online, whether the band is, one of the guys from the band is doing, just doing a little acoustic thing, or there's kind of a happy hour that the bands are doing together or something like that. I think it's really kind of adapting to the current situation, which again we're all in uncharted water and we're all trying to figure this out. But I think for the most part, a lot of bands have really adapted to it properly, and again, giving the fans something to kind of get through these times. I think from a financial standpoint, again, it goes back to the content and ways to monetize that, whether that's through YouTube or some kind of subscription platform that you're subscribing and you get once a week. You're getting a live performance from the artist or something like that to really create or merch. I mean, I think merch is. Like I know Stick Figure did a big merch sale and Trevor Hall did a big merch sale, and a lot of artists are doing these big merch sales. And again, it's like having the fan base and the platform obviously helps with that. But I think making sure there's something out there that people that you can connect with that just isn't at a live show. Again, live shows obviously are a big part of all of our. Is really kind of what needs to happen is really kind of really kind of really kind of getting things together. All right, next question. Sorry, I was getting a call there. Let's see here. Has Gentleman played Cali Roots yet? Gentleman has never played Cali Roots. We've had offers in for him before. People that don't know, Gentleman is a reggae artist out of Germany. Another artist that if you haven't checked out, definitely check out Gentleman. He's actually going to be on the Cali Roots rhythm, and I think he's a great artist. That it's just hard for. He travels with 20 people, so it's definitely hard to get him from Germany to Monterey, California. So. Let's see here. And this, I don't even know how to answer this question. Why do they name so many cities in California after Santa Claus? I just how to answer that one. That's a good question though. CMB Reggae, any thoughts about Virginia Beach as a venue? I mean, obviously, Virginia Beach is definitely something that we've thought about, years ago. Nothing currently. Again, just trying to get through the next 12 months before we kind of look at doing anything. This one's coming in from Law Records. Thinking back over the last 3 years, what are the top 3 particular sets or moments that stand out the most? Like I said, last year was definitely Tosh Santana's set, just because that was a set I actually took in. Last year was a big year for us. Last year was year 10, and a lot of work went into year 10. And I think some of the moments for me, I think obviously for every festival that we do, I'm always the one that calls the gates. I'm always the ones that open the gates. Last year I spent some time outside of the festival grounds before gates opened, and I think just kind of feeling the excitement and of the fans that were coming in. This is at 9:30 a.m. There's a line wrapped around the venue, for people to get in for our gates at 10:30. And just kind of feeling that energy, I think was a moment that stood out for me. I think another moment that stood out for me, it's nothing to do with the music side of it. It was my wife, who was Amy, who was out there with our daughter McKenna strapped to her chest. This was when McKenna was, gosh, very young. So I think she was less than a year old, and Amy was out there kind of controlling the lines. And I can remember somebody saying, there's this lady out here like yelling at people to get in line because they were all on. They were like, people were spilling into the road. So Amy was out there controlling the line. And has a baby strapped to her chest. And in my head, I'm like, oh my God, that's my wife and my daughter out there. So I think, it kind of goes back to family business, and that's really what Cali Roots is. It's family. And I think for me, that was a big moment because, it's like, my wife and my not even a year old daughter out there kind of, running the lines in the front of the venue. So, yeah. So hopefully that answers your question, Law Records. Is from the Elevators. Big ups to Elevators. Again, love those guys. If you guys aren't listening to the Elevators, you should definitely start. They also have a track on the Cali Roots Rhythm. So they have a question here. If you had to pick, what's the one thing you know about running a festival that you wish you knew when you first started? How hard it is. I think obviously, when you start doing the festivals, festivals are hard to do. I mean, they're challenging events to put on, and I think one of the biggest takeaways that I have. I mean, you guys can see. I mean, I'm only I'm in my early 40s, and I'm like completely gray because it's not from anything else but doing festivals. But for real, I think one of the biggest things that I wish I knew when I first started festivals is the how responsible you are for people that are attending your event. I think that is one of the biggest takeaways. People always tell me, hey, you have such a serious look on your face. Everybody that knows me knows that I have a look on my face when I'm running a festival. And I think, the main reason is because, this is, we're responsible for 12,000 people plus the bands and plus the staff. Like everybody, for me, it's like everybody's coming to my house, and like, I'm responsible to make sure that everybody leaves safely, everybody has a good time, that nobody gets hurt. And so I think that responsibility is something that, when I first started doing events, I picked up in it early enough, but once we started doing Cali Roots to the level it's at, and how big it's become, I think it really kind of sunk in that, like, hey, like, you're responsible. Like, that's why there's big insurance policies that we have to get, and security and other safety precautions that we have to put into place. Which is again why we postpone the events. Obviously, for the public safety, the public health crisis we're in right now. And so I think that was one of probably the biggest thing that came out of it is kind of the responsibility that you have for other people. So it's not just one big party for me. It's like we basically throw the party. So this is another question from Joe. For people that know me, also know that like I said earlier, I do listen to a lot of music outside of reggae. And one of the things that we've definitely putting focus in is some of the country stuff that we've been doing, and kind of like that outlaw country. So we definitely want to keep growing that, and keep kind of progressing. Our foothold in kind of some of the country music that we're doing. So, but again, we have to get through the next 12 months to figure out what we're going to do here. So, let's see here. What else we got? No. So let me scroll through some of these. And it's kind of all the questions we got. Any other questions out there? Definitely let me kind of hear from from music, industry people. I mean, last week, my partner Igor did one, and Igor is, he's got this gift of gab. So it was a really, really well done, Q&A. So, I thank everybody for definitely kind of, joining us on this, and thanks, to Reed and the entire Rootfire team for putting not just this one together, but all the sessions that they've been doing. I watched the Mike Love one a few days ago. And, I mean, it's such a good avenue and a good platform, and it's giving people positive energy, so, let's see here. Ashley, what really made you decide to start creating these festivals and continuing after all these years of having a family? I mean, I think, obviously, festivals, once we started doing festivals, I realized rather quickly that, like, this is what I want to do. I mean, obviously there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into producing a festival, both mentally, physically, financially. These things cost a lot of money to put on, and people always think, like, that we're just rolling in it, but really these things take a lot of money to put on. But as we start to develop them, and we developed this Cali Roots brand that has spawned into other brands. I think it's important to have these festivals, because I think it's part of shaping people. I think some people really, they really come to these festivals, and it kind of, they become, almost not a different person, but they kind of grow from it. And I think it's important to keep producing these events, even in this current landscape. I think it's extremely important to kind of keep producing these. And I mean, they're super fun to put on. I mean, I wake up every single day, well, recently it's been a little bit more challenging, but I wake up every single day like loving what I do. Like, I get to produce music festivals, I get to produce shows. This is like, I'm very lucky to have, to be able to do this for a living again. And I think, as long as I can keep doing it, I will continue to keep doing it. And I think creating new festivals, will definitely be something that we do in the future. But yeah, it's a lot of fun, and again, brings me lots of happiness to keep doing these. Here's one from an old friend, Robert, out in Florida. Hey, Robert from Florida. What % of your festival budget is geared towards fan experience? That's a good question. And I think, for Cali Roots, part of the experience is, obviously the people that are there. And I think it's just giving people that platform to kind of, to be able to kind of hang out with one another. I think, my percentage for fan experience is probably, 10 to 15%, whereas like an EDC or even a Lightning in a Bottle or some of these other festivals, their fan experience is probably much higher, as far as, the budget, the line item goes. But yeah, I mean, I'd say probably, 10 to 15 to 20% of our budget is geared towards festival experience, towards fan experience. And that includes, art and VIP lounges and lighting around the venue, even the marketing. I consider, some of that marketing is definitely considered, fan experience. So, yeah, that's kind of, that's a good question, Robert. Thank you. Big ups to Iatera tuning in as well. Thank you. Another band. If you guys haven't checked, Iatera is definitely grinding it out. I love those guys. Great music, great vibes. So, Rich from Richard. Will you ever move the fest to Laguna Seca? Camping, bigger area. The quick answer is absolutely not. We definitely will not be moving into Laguna Seca. Laguna Seca has a 10 p.m. curfew. You have, 10 different agencies that you have to get permits from. It's very desolate. It's definitely not the vibe. I mean, we understand that, this question comes up a lot, and I think, for me, it's a pretty simple no. I think there's sound ordinance out there. You have, the race houses that complain about any sound, any and all sound, and so we have our offsite camping at Laguna Seca, but we definitely won't be producing Cali Roots there. So we're happy at the Monterey County Fairgrounds, and it's a good home for us. What else we got here? And I think the other, one other thing, as we wait for a couple more questions to come in, I think one of the things that Cali Roots will be putting out over the next few days is something called the Good Vibes Movement, and my team has been working, incredibly hard to kind of create what we're calling the Good Vibes Movement, which will, have different things that we can provide fans. Obviously, we've been putting out the coloring book. We've been putting out the full sets. The other thing that we're going to work on is kind of bedtime stories for the kids, that some of the artists in the Cali Roots scene will kind of record and put out. So there's definitely things like that that we'll be putting out. And we also want to like get recipes from some of our favorite bands. Like what's Trevor Hall cooking right now, and like, is that a recipe that we can get and then share with the fans, and the fans can then cook that, or what's Eric from Revolution cooking right now. I think it's kind of coming up with those things as we're all sheltering in place and staying home and staying safe. I think it's important for us to really kind of give you guys more content and more good vibes to kind of get through this. I mean, it's just hard times we're going through, and everybody's dealing with it. So let's see here. This is from Pacific Roots Music. Thoughts in using the small pop-up stage for doing a local band showcase. That's something we've definitely kicked around. To kind of, most people that have been going to Cali Roots for years knows that that's kind of where the festival started. So we call it the OG stage, because that's that small stage in the middle of the bowl and the Cali Roots stage. That's where Cali Roots started. And so, I think, we could definitely look at, using that for something local pop-up. In the years past has been kind of the streaming stage where we've had interviews and stuff like that. But it's definitely something that's possible. So, yeah. What else? Any other questions out there? McKenna, you got any questions, McKenna?
Nothing.
No questions? Okay. See? It was a hard no. Sometimes you have to do a hard no on some things. Let's see if there's any other questions I can pull up here. So.
All right, I'll just have a coffee.
Let's see. I got one. All right, here we go. Here's a couple years ago, as the layout changed to move the food vendors all the way to one side. How long have been thinking about that? Do you want to say hi? Here's my lovely wife, Amy.
Hi.
All right, and there she goes. We have glitter all over their faces. That's how we rock here in the shelter in place. And here's our little dog, Leo. You want to say hi, Leo? Come on, up. Come on. There we go. Oh, no, he's shy. Anyways, so so we changed the layout a few years ago because, quite frankly, the lines were like, we had lines that were people were coming from one stage to the other, and they were just going through these food lines, and it created a big problem. And so we decided to make that change and move most of the food vendors into the RV lot, which definitely opened up the midway for us to not have people running into lines from going from one stage to the other. Again, and I think it's extremely important to listen to the fans, to what the feedback they do. That's why we do these these surveys for fans. We really want to know what the fans are thinking about the festival and thinking about the layout, and things that can help improve the experience. We know that people don't have an endless supply of money, and they just can't go to every single festival. So we want to make sure that if they're choosing our festival to go to, that they're getting their money's worth, and they're feeling that energy. So again, we definitely listened to the fans in that one and made that change a few years ago. So constantly trying to figure out how we make it better. So any other questions coming in? Let me see if I have any more here coming in.
I'll get my shoes on.
Yeah, I hope everybody is definitely, like I said, hanging in there, being safe, if you got it, if you can make sure that you check in on friends, right now, phone calls and text messages. I mean, we're doing a lot of Zoom. I think it's extremely important to kind of, check in with people, and make sure everybody's doing okay, and everybody has what they need. And it's again, we're in hard times, but we're strong. We'll kind of get through this. And music is definitely a big part of that, and knowing that the sun will rise another day, and we'll all get through this. So yeah, let me see if there's any other questions here. Sorry. All right. Here's another one from. Yeah, I actually managed a couple bands in the past. I actually managed ground. I actually booked Groundation for a little bit. I managed the band Thrive for a little bit. I really just, I like I said, I just really started doing shows and really kind of, you know, grew within the reggae scene. That's definitely what I cut my teeth on, and kind of, really kind of graduated to producing festivals. I think it's really good to kind of, I think to like get out there and like really hit the streets. I mean, I was passing out flyers in front of venues for years. Putting up posters. Like we used to do these poster runs, at UCSC, and like there'd be one person driving, and in their promoter career is put up posters and be on the street team and like really hammering the ground, because I mean that's, yeah, social media is massive. But I think street teaming is definitely something that should not be overlooked. I think obviously some of the smaller shows that we've done in the past, there was barely any marketing budget, so we had to like really grassroots it. And I didn't have X amount to put into digital, X amount to put into radio. Like we had the streets, and so I think that's kind of really something that is important, and that's kind of one of the big things that I've taken away from producing the small, when I was doing a lot smaller shows. So let's see what else we have here. There's another one from Robert out in Florida. Um, how do you get the inside scoop with the up and coming hot bands? Well, I mean, fortunately, we've become part of the inside scoop, right? Fortunately, we've become part of that process. Again, I think it's constantly, it's listening to the fans too. I think the fans almost have a better pulse sometimes. I mean, there's a lot, excuse me. Excuse me. I think that the fans really have their finger on the pulse, a lot more than a lot of us. I think and there's some of those really diehard fans, and I think listening to what they're talking about when you ask somebody, hey, what band do you want to hear, and somebody says, so and so, and you've never heard of them, and you pull up their Spotify and their YouTube and their Instagram, and like, wow, these guys are really good, and so then you kind of really kind of keep an eye on that, know. Sometimes an agent will come to me and bring mention, that you mentioned something about a band. I mean, Tosh Santana was brought to me by their agent, and I had no idea who she was. And he said, "Dude, I'm hooking you up with this," and I'm like, "All right, now let's see." And we had him that first year, and we had her that had Tosh that first year, and she blew it up. And I think listening to people like that. Same thing with Nako. I mean, Nako, like I was talking earlier about the Carolina Sessions, Soja, Elliot Harrington, Soja's manager, brought Soja, brought Nako to me and said, "Hey, man, you got to check this artist out." And I think it's definitely listening to what people are mentioning and listening to the fans. And I think, it's important, because there's a lot of undiscovered talent out there. There's a lot of bands that have been doing it for years, and that sometimes go overlooked. And I think it's important to kind of listen to people. So yeah, thanks, Robert. All right, any other questions out there? Hope everybody's having a good time as best as they can right now. Don't forget, if you have Sirius, or I think Sirius is actually doing a 3-month free trial right now. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure they are, though. I think Sirius is doing a free free trial. So make sure if you can to go ahead and get serious and make sure you listen to the Cali Roots radio show on Sirius on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Myself, I host the second hour, and Eric Rachmani from Revolution hosts the first hour. So make sure you guys take that nice selfless plug. um, Anthony Flood, any intentions on bringing bands from overseas, the Skins, etc.? Hey, we brought a bunch of bands from overseas, but the Skins have played the festival a couple times. We have Mellow Mood, came over a couple years ago. We definitely Sticky Fingers from Australia came up. I mean, we definitely have I definitely keep an eye on those kind of bands. One of the bands we'd love to bring over, I just don't think it's possible now. I mean, Dub Inc. is coming over from France, but the band Seed, that's S, with 3 E's, is another band we'd love to bring over from Europe. So, I mean, I think we definitely have to kind of keep our eyes on, the world as, all the music that's coming out of it. I mean, we've looked at bringing in, there's a really good South Korean reggae band that we'd love to bring in as well. I mean, there's music like that, I think it's important to kind of keep expanding, on my horizons, but the fans' horizons as well, as far as music goes, All right. Any more questions out there? Well, I hope everybody is. Let's see what they have. Yes, and yes, my nails are colored. That's what you get from working from home. This was, again, my daughter painted my fingernails green. Anybody that has a kid, anybody that has a daughter knows that you can't really say no if she wants to take you to the house spa that we have here and paint your fingernails. Real men don't mind if their fingernails are painted green. So it looks a lot better now. At first, it was all over. It was all over my skin, but we cleaned that up. So yes, my fingernails are colored. But again, that's that dad life, and it's that quarantine life, really. So, we want everybody cooking out there. I mean, we got people. I mean, anybody got a Traeger out there? I've been doing a lot of Traeger. Anybody into the Traegers? I've been doing a lot of Traegers. I was going to cook this. I got this 15-pound brisket, but then I realized that I can't eat that. Me and my family can't eat that much brisket, so it's still in the freezer. But cooking is definitely a way to get through this. Here, this is from Brenda. Can we expect to see coffee on the future lineups? That's a great question. That's a great question. I don't have an answer for that. I wish we could. I wish we could get her on the lineup. It's definitely not from a lack of trying. I mean, I think she's definitely an artist we would love on the festival, and we'll see what happens. Maybe 2021 we'll be able to get her on. So, here's a Traeger question. What is the best thing you have smoked in your Traeger? That's a really good question. I really make really good ribs in a Traeger. I try not to do sugar too much, and so I make my own barbecue sauce. We smoke the ribs for probably 6 hours, and they're fantastic. You wrap them. You wrap them without foil for 3 or 4 hours, and you wrap them with foil, and you put foil on it for 3 hours, or butcher paper, and smoke them for another 3 hours. Tri-tips are really good. I smoked a tri-tip a couple days ago. You do like an hour and a half smoke on it, and then turn the Traeger up and sear it for 3 minutes per side. So, that's that's again, those are the things that are kind of getting me through. So, here's one from KR Plum. Where there be shows at Planet Gemini? Well, Planet Gemini is no more. It's called another. It's under Silva's nightclub now. It went from Planet Gemini to Planet Gemini to the Jade Lounge to Silva's now. We will have after parties there. We were about ready to announce them before all this went down, so we will sort those out and get those announced in the next 2 months or so. What do we got here? How do you see the music industry changing after all this is over, specifically the live music industry? I mean, that's a great question. I think we're all trying to figure that out. I personally think that your smaller festivals, smaller, I mean, 10,000 and under, even 5,000 and under, I think those festivals will probably, I think you'll see more of those pop up. I think venues will probably be the first ones to come back online to kind of really start doing things, but like not your 3,000 cap venues. I think your 300 to 500 venues will probably be the first ones to kind of, get through this. And then I think music festivals will come shortly after that. I mean, it all comes down to how this is handled. I think from a federal level, and we'll see how all that goes. I definitely don't want to get into any of that right now, politics and stuff like that. But I think the music industry will come back. It's a strong industry. It's not going anywhere. And I think people, are really, we're a social being. So I think people will kind of gravitate towards back to live music, and live music's healing. I think people more than ever need it, and I think, we'll get through this. Obviously there'll be, financial constraints and stuff like that, people they'll deal with. And I think that will kind of affect things. But I mean, really, the future. I think that's the crazy thing about this time that we're in right now, is that there's so much uncertainty. There's no end date to it. There's no this will happen after this is over. None of that. I mean, I think it's a very uncertain time for all of us, and we're all just trying to kind of stay positive and do the best we can. And I think that's the big thing can. So, but yeah, how it will change, it's I think over the next 2 months we'll kind of see more of a how the new normal looks. So yeah. And there she goes. Let's see. It looks like my connection might be unstable. There we go. All right. Let's see here. Any other questions? Any other feedback out there? Let's see. Let me look at my questions here. Fantastic. I think I got most of the questions here. Let me know if there's any other questions. You hit a read. All right. Well, guys, thank you guys so much. This has been a pleasure. I thank again, like I said earlier, thanks, Reed, and the entire Rootfire crew. Again, it means a lot that you guys took the time out and listened to me for an hour and 20. Kind of ramble on. So I appreciate it all. And hopefully, hopefully I was able to give you guys some good information. Yeah, until next time, stay safe out there. Shelter in place. Like I said, be safe. Take care of one another. More so than ever, we definitely need each other in this moment. So, thank you guys. Until the next time, peace out with my orange fingers. Thank you guys. It's been a pleasure as always. Did I say orange? Orange, green, same thing. All right, guys. Thank you, guys.
And he really has green fingers. Thank you, bye.
All right.